Welcome to Sri Lanka on 99.94. My name is Mark Machado from the Marillion. As always, I'm joined by Estelle Devon from the Papare. And today we have a very special guest. He's the author of, as far as I'm aware, the only comprehensive history of cricket on Sri Lanka or Ceylon, whatever you want, or Serendip, as far back as you want to go. That's Nick Brookes, the author of An Island's 11. We brought Nick on. I thought this was the right moment to bring him on because Nick is talk us through the history of selectors for Sri Lanka. But before we get on to that, Nick, I think we want to talk a little bit about the book. I've read most of the book. I'm not going to lie, it's pretty much become my Bible. I probably shouldn't say that. It's almost heresy, I suppose. But what inspired you to write it, and how long did it take you to put it together? Because it's really, really long and really, really detailed. That is not criticism at all. If anything, I'd want an extra 1,000 pages. What was your motivation to write it?
Oh, well, hey guys, thank you so much for having me on. Big fan of the pod. I guess really what inspired me to write it was a kind of shortfall or sparsity of Sri Lankan literature on cricket. I think probably the first thing to say is that I grew up watching cricket in the 90s, and so my perception of Sri Lanka's standing in world cricket compared to the reality was kind of different. I saw them as this world-beating team who'd always been part of the furniture, who were right at the top table, whereas in reality, certainly in a more kind of administrative sense, they were still kind of new to the scene, being treated as a bit of a minnow. And so, it was only when I got to adulthood that I found out that Sri Lanka had only got Test status in 1982 and that they'd had this rapid rise. And really that the kind of pre-test history was very patchily recorded. So I thought there was kind of, it was a project that needed doing. Every other major cricket nation has a comprehensive history. Sri Lanka doesn't even really have a cricketing canon. And lots of stories, it felt to me, were kind of falling through the cracks. And it felt like a project that needed to be done. And the more I kind of looked into it, the more obsessed I got, the more interesting I found Sri Lankan cricket to be. And it's got a rich, colourful history that in many ways I think is very unique, the way that cricket has developed in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, just one question. I listened to your episode with Sri Lanka Cricket Podcast, and there's an interesting story about how you actually ended up in Sri Lanka and, how you got in touch with someone at St. Thomas's College. Want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously, one of the first things I found out when I started researching into Sri Lankan cricket was, the incredible strength of schools cricket and the Royal Thomian tradition. And so when I was making my first research trip to Sri Lanka, I knew that I had to go and see Royal College and St. Thomas's, try and talk to people there and find out about those schools' traditions. And so I called St. Thomas's just, I think, off this very laptop on Skype. And by complete chance, the assistant chaplain picked up my call, Father Roshan Mendes. And we've spoken about this subsequently. I don't know how this happened because he's never in the reception or where my call should have gone. But somehow I ended up speaking to him, and he is just like a cricket-obsessed priest. And we struck an instant bond. He invited me to come and do some interviews at St. Thomas's and showed me around all their cricket facilities. And then when it came to moving Sri Lanka, he was kind of a link who said, why don't you think about coming and helping at the school? And so that was really fortunate because it meant that when I sort of first lived in Sri Lanka, I had this St. Thomas's connection. So I was kind of integrated in the heart of schools cricket. And it helped me with, I guess, the connections that I made, but also how much cricket was around and seeing schools cricket, I guess, not quite being involved in it, but being right next to it.
And what was that like?
It was amazing.
From what I understand, it's pretty unique, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it was incredible. I had lodgings at school, which really like overlooked the cricket ground. So I set my desk up in front of these big French windows that were right behind the bowler's arm, looking out onto the cricket pitch. And I mean, it was amazing. You know, like cricket always being played, and a really high standard of cricket, and kind of weird for coming from England. I mean, Mark, you'll know, like schools cricket, the crowd is like a guy, a dog, and that's about it. Whereas like in Sri Lanka, I was looking out, seeing, you know, big crowds, and also simultaneously like watching the match on my laptop with commentary from the Papare. So I mean, it's just like incomparable to the sort of like basic level of schools cricket that we have in England.
Nick, before you got to Sri Lanka, how aware were you? Obviously, you were aware of the cricket, but how aware were you of the kind of culture off the island and, you know, things like the food and drink? Had you ever had a string hopper before you got there? Was Lion your favourite beer? Like, you know,
No, I must say that I came to like Sri Lanka for the first time as a total rookie. I'd never had a string hopper. I didn't know what an egg hopper was. Um I had a kotu because actually where I'm from in South London, we've got quite a strong Sri Lankan community. And so way back in about 2010, my brother was like, "You've got to try this," and took me for a kotu. I'm not sure at the time if I was even aware that it was Sri Lankan. But no, I really knew very little, and so I was very. I had to kind of throw myself into that culture and the history. And there was lots of writing, which was very helpful. K.M. De Silva's History of Sri Lanka was really good, but also a book that Nira Wickramasinghe had written about Sri Lanka's history. I can't remember what it's called, but you know, there was lots of good stuff that helped me kind of, I guess, immerse myself in that. And I think being at St. Thomas's and, you know, like having to go to staff meetings and stuff like that was kind of helpful as well, because you got to see, in a sense, the way that Sri Lankan organizations work and how that might be slightly different to like similar organizations in England. I felt like it was kind of like a tiny little insight to how a cricket board might work.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, once you got here, um, and just kind of, like you mentioned, there's not much literature around kind of the history of the game in Sri Lanka, right? Like, how did you go about finding out? Like, I mean, Mark was telling me some stories about the selectors and stuff, which I haven't heard. So, like, how did you go about that?
Um, well, I guess I have to like really credit what writing there was, particularly like going right back to the early 20th century. SP Phonander, who's done some amazing stuff on the early days. Then you've also got people like Michael Roberts, the academic, who's done some great work, and SS Pereira, whose Janashakti book of cricket. I don't know if you've come across it, Estelle. It's a huge book, which kind of like goes through Sri Lankan history, cricket history, not in a narrative way, but like year by year, giving sort of the major events. That was hugely helpful. Uh, and then there were other like really rare books which I managed to find. I don't know if you guys have heard of Channa Gunasekara, who opened the batting for Ceylon in the 50s, but I found that he'd written a couple of books which were incredibly helpful. And then I think the other side of things was that because the Sri Lankan cricket community, I guess, is much smaller, more tightly knit than in England, I was able to like track down and talk to lots of the ancestors. Oh no, sorry, the descendants rather of some of the early cricketers. So I guess people like you know, C.H. Gunasekara. I managed to talk to Shanti Gunasekara, who was his daughter-in-law. Bill Greswell. I managed to talk to his grandson. Desaram and Sathasivam, I managed to speak to their sons and daughters. So stuff like that was really helpful. And I think that if you were doing a project on English cricket, I mean, I don't know, trying to track down Plum Warner's grandson to talk to would probably be much more difficult. So that was, yeah, the people who I spoke to were very helpful. And also the Colombo archives, which like I feel like not that many people know about, but it's an incredible resource that has newspapers on microfilm going back to the 1800s. And so I was able to, you know, go and get like the Colombo Gazette from 1895 and go through it page by page and find out sort of like match reports and stuff like that. So, I mean, the resources are out there. I wish that I had more time and more words and more money to do more research. But I hope that this book will be the start of something and will inspire more people to look into aspects of Sri Lankan cricket history because, this was just a little starting point and there's so much more to be delved out and discovered.
It's really interesting because there's definitely been an explosion of Sri Lankan cricket content, right? If you go back kind of 4 or 5 years ago, there was very little on YouTube or on, there was almost no podcast specializing or talking specifically about Sri Lankan cricket. I suppose every cricket team, every sport in the world has had an explosion of content creation around it. But I suppose the upside of it is that the kind of future Nicks, in 30, 40 years time, 50 years time, someone's going to write a book about this period. There appears to be at least a lot more kind of conversation around the team, which is, I suppose, only a good thing, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think for a long time, Sri Lankan cricket looked outwards, right? It was looking back towards England. And I mean, if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, you were more likely to find, scores from the county championship in the newspapers than coverage of local cricket. And so I think that maybe it took Sri Lanka a while to realize how the value of its own cricket and that it didn't have to always be looking back to Lords. I mean, I think it's kind of a separate point, but I don't know if you guys know the story that in the 80s, a lot of Sri Lankan first-class records were lost because they were sending scorecards to Lords to be ratified. And I think that eventually it was like, no, you do this yourself now, you're a test-playing nation. And so, I mean, I think it took Sri Lanka a while to get out of that mindset of being a smaller cricketing country that was always looking for kind of approval and seeing itself as less valid than, England and Australia. But I mean, there's been an explosion, you're right to say, Mark, and I think a lot of that comes from incredible writers and cricket commentators who are really passionate and get that through. I mean, what Shehan Karunatilaka did with Chinaman, the way Andrew Fidel Fernando has covered the team, both currently, but also aspects of history. I think he's written some amazing pieces on Cricket Monthly that, touch on stuff like the first time Sri Lanka came to Lords in 1984, the first time, the World Cup in 96, So I think there's a growing awareness of the uniqueness of Sri Lankan cricket. And I guess also that dramatic rise, right, from being kind of a minnow to being the best one-day team in the world in the space of a decade, 15 years. I guess that inspires a lot of people to write about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and hopefully, I'm here to consume as much of it as I possibly can get my hands on. So hopefully, there's a lot more still to come. Shall we take a quick break? When we come back, Nick, I want to talk to you about why exactly the sports minister has to ratify any national squad.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
So please make sure to follow 99.94 on all the social apps, Twitter, Facebook. I think there might be a 99.94 Tinder profile. I don't think you can follow Tinder profiles. I just said that, but that's not in any way true. But if you see it on Tinder, why don't you match with it and then download the app? And then the two of you can live happily ever after.
Is there a picture of Jared on it? Is that the...
Maybe. Welcome to the Kimberverse, right? That'd be the slogan, I'd imagine. Anyway, we've got Nick Brookes here, the kind of, I was going to say kind of, the author of the history of Sri Lankan cricket. So Nick, we're there at the moment. There's a lot of issues around who the selectors will be. We about a week ago, I'm recording this on Friday, the 3rd of February 2023. About a week ago, we heard that we will potentially get new selectors. I won't go into the nitty gritty of that. A week later, as it stands, we have absolutely no idea if this is happening or not. Me and Estelle recorded a pod about it earlier on in the week. And I told Estelle a story that basically the reason why the sports minister has to sign off on any national squad is because we were there was an incident where the selectors ended up selecting themselves. And then Estelle said she'd never heard that story before. Where did I discover it? It was obviously from your book. So I thought it'd be great to get you on to expand a little bit more on this and tell us the whole story about how this all happened.
Yeah, so as I understand it, every squad has had to be ratified by the sports minister since 1973, and this was part of something called the sports law, which was, as you say, Mark, introduced as a direct response to what happened around the cancelled 1968 tour of England. So around this time, the mid-60s was a hugely successful period for Ceylon cricket. I think Michael Tissera was established as captain and was by far the most successful captain Ceylon had ever had. I mean, they won a kind of unofficial test against Pakistan A in 1964, and then they go to India in 64-65 and win a test match, unofficial test in Ahmedabad, which is the springboard for Ceylon getting associate ICC status and really starting to be put on the map of world cricket. So anyway, that's the kind of pretext. Then we come to Ceylon's annual AGM in 1968. And back in these days, the selectors were selected by votes, kind of like the board president still is now, right? So you'd have teams from Division 1 and Division 2 were both allocated votes, and they would vote the selectors in. And the 1968 panel was really unusual because it contained H.I.K. Fernando, who was the existing wicket-keeper in the national side, Dhanasiri Weerasinghe, who was selected as the new chairman of selectors, who had played for Ceylon as recently as 1965. He gave an assurance when he was picked as a selector that he wasn't going to make himself available for selection, so that kind of eased some concerns. So there were those two, and then there was a guy called Sam Abisekara, who was also elected newly, and Chandra Shafter, who remained from the pre-existing panel. So as I understand it, as I've been told, Abu Fuad, who is a name who you guys may have come across, was the man who was responsible for putting this panel in place. Fuad apparently kind of worked as an insurance broker or something like that. He was a bit of a wheeler dealer, and he got all the second division teams to kind of vote in Fernando and Weerasinghe, guys whose ear he had. Fuad had been, ever since the 1965 tour of India, he'd been kind of sidelined. He was always looked in battle with Dennis Chambagam for the spinner's berth. And then suddenly in 1968, ahead of this kind of proposed England tour, Abu Fuad's back and Michael Tissera is dropped as captain. H.I.K. Fernando, one of the selectors, is suddenly the new captain. And so, I mean, this ruffles some feathers, right? Chandra Shafter storms out of the meeting, I think, and is like, what the hell is going on? He says if there is a repeat of this, then he's gone as a selector. And so it comes to selecting the team that's going to go to England to 1968. I mean, this is a huge moment for Sri Lanka because they've never been on a tour to England before. And basically, it's like an opportunity for them to prove that they can play over an extended period of time. It's like an audition for test status, right? But so not only is Fernando selected as captain again and Fuad is in again, but now Weerasinghe, the chairman of selectors, is also included in the squad. So Chandra Shafter storms out, rendering the meeting null and void, and basically like the tour collapses. Not solely due to this, there are other issues going on at the time around FX as well, but essentially the selectors picking themselves like swells into a national embarrassment. And I think people in England were really annoyed because, like the counties had set aside days for games. I believe it was Leary Constantine, who had previously coached in Ceylon, had like done loads of stuff, putting logistics in place so the team could tour. And then they cancel at the last minute, and it's kind of a slap in the face for everyone. And I think there is no doubt that this basically puts back Sri Lanka's ambitions towards Test status. Had the 68 tour gone ahead, I think it's very likely that Sri Lanka get Test status sometime in the early 70s, rather than having to wait until 1981, playing their first Test in 82. So, yeah, really the sports laws brought in 1973 to kind of prevent another national embarrassment like that from happening. But as we see, it potentially starts to cause some problems.
That sounds like Sri Lanka, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's very
Although I must
typically
say,
Sri
like,
Lankan.
I think on the whole, the problems have been more hypothetical than actual. I know in 1979, for the selection of the World Cup squad, there were some issues. A weird old squad was picked. And there was kind of this bizarre thing that happened where Ranjit Fernando, I think, was selected as the wicket keeper, and then deselected, and they were like, players over 35 won't be going on this tour. And then they realized that their star bowler, Diaz de Silva, was nearly 37. So they were like, no, batsmen over 35 won't be going on this tour. But as far as I can tell, that's one of the major incidents involving sort of like where things have gone murky. I think the other time I can think about where the sports minister had to get involved was around 2002, 2003, when Sanath Jayasuriya was captain, and it was Guida Alvis's panel, and they, I think, just could not see eye to eye on the squads that were getting selected. And so I think Sports Minister, maybe Johnson Fernando it was then, didn't ratify a couple of the Alvis's squads, probably quite rightly. I think there was one in the wake of the 2003 World Cup that was really quite bizarre. But I think on the whole, the Sports Minister has stayed out of things.
Yeah, I was just like, obviously that's something I don't think a lot of people would have heard about. What would you say was like the most fascinating person to interview or speak to? Because we've, like Mark mentioned, there's been kind of this explosion of content over the last 5 to 10 years, right? But like previous to that, there's very little that a lot of people know about the teams and the backroom story. So what was kind of the most, or what caught you off guard?
Yeah, I mean, like, gosh, so much, Estelle. That whole, as you say, the whole history, like prior to 82, people don't really know very much about. And so, I mean, that was like a huge learning period. I loved learning about the really from the 30s through to Test status, how all the amazing things that happened. I mean, talking to someone like David Hine, who was around in the 60s and 70s and was incredibly generous with his time with me. I think we ended up, spending countless afternoons just sort of talking about cricket in Sri Lanka in the 60s and 70s. I mean, that was an incredible education for me, and hearing about, I mean, we've just been talking about the 1965 tour, which, I mean, talking to the guys about that was incredible. All these things that you don't even think about, the fact that they had to travel thousands of miles on trains, and, staying in kind of really basic rest houses. I was told one story where they were put up in a cricket ground kind of storage room in bunks, and it had just been freshly painted, so it stank. And some of the players complained and were like, can we go and stay in a guest house in town? And the only place they could find rooms was like even worse than this stadium storeroom. But they had tail between their legs, then had to stay there. I think on one train journey that was like 2-3 days long, they were scared of, buying food, so they had to survive on nothing but fruit. So kind of, like these just like incredible little details and stories of things that you never consider. I found that really interesting, and especially the amateur tradition. I think in other places where cricketers still had to hold like jobs, they were largely ceremonial. But in Ceylon, these guys were working full time, and cricket was squeezed in around busy work schedules. It was, like an hour of practice from 5 to 6 before it gets dark. And I mean, so I think, really understanding the extent of that was incredible. And I was told that, I mean, even when C. I. Gunasekara was captaining Ceylon in the 50s, he'd face jibes at work when he had to miss days. And so, I mean, hearing those stories, which you really kind of take for granted or just don't even consider, was fascinating. And you realize how many people made huge sacrifices to allow Sri Lankan cricket to reach the place where it has. And, I mean, not just playing for free, but also kind of being acceptant that you weren't going to be promoted at work because you were playing so much cricket, right? And I mean, it's sad that we saw a trend which, I mean, even continued past Test status, where a lot of guys had to leave the game at 30 because they're like, now I have to provide for my family. So yeah, there was so much that I found incredibly fascinating, but I think understanding the extent of that sacrifice, which laid the foundations for Sri Lankan cricket, was really amazing.
Nick, is there resentment about the lack of Test status and maybe some of the issues around administration and finance from some of the older players when you go back, when you spend time with people who played before Test status, or do they just see themselves as, or broadly, do they see themselves as being part of the process that was needed to be in place to get to where cricket's at now?
I think if there is any resentment, it's like around 68. When I spoke to people, the players who were around at the time, there was a real sense of sadness of just like opportunity lost. And I think they were all aware. I mean, it was really sad because the guys, were fully in training to go to England in 1968. They were doing their pre-test kind of fitness. And so they were being, coming under I think an Air Force guy who was getting them to the SSC at 5 o'clock every morning to, run endless laps. And I heard from a number of those guys, they were like, we went through all of that. We basically could have run the whole way to England, and we did it all for nothing. So I think there was a little bit of definitely disappointment over that, definitely a sense of we messed this up. But I think those players who were around in the 70s know the contributions they made. I think it's sad that, guys like Tissera, Tenakun, Hine, Fernando never got the chance to represent Sri Lanka in tests. But I think that they know that their contribution was huge. And I hope that my book also kind of brings that into focus a little bit and shows that Sri Lanka had a tradition of great cricketers and had produced great batsmen kind of all the way through the 20th century. And it didn't start with Dilip and Roy, basically.
Shall we take a quick break there? When we come back, let's talk about where you think Sri Lanka cricket's at in 2023.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
So Nick, thanks again for joining us. Just to remind people, you're the author of An Island's 11. It's the most comprehensive history of Sri Lanka cricket ever been written. Your book finishes in 2014 on I suppose the peak of a good, probably the best period of Sri Lankan cricket in terms of winning tournaments, the teams were putting out competitive, probably the most at any given point, the most number of players who are bona fide actual legends of the game making up an 11. Since then, though, it's been a slightly rockier road for Sri Lanka. We lost our way quite a bit. What are your kind of takes on where Sri Lankan cricket is at in early 2023?
think it's not straightforward, is it? I guess stuff with Sri Lankan cricket's never straightforward, and something that I continually point out is like, no doubt the last decade has been a period that no self-respecting Sri Lankan fan would celebrate or wish to commemorate. But still, there have been amazing days, right? You know, like 3-0 against Australia at home, becoming the first Asian side to win a Test series in South Africa, beating England at the 2019 World Cup when they were all-conquering champions, winning the Asia Cup out of nowhere. So I think that no matter how far Sri Lanka sinks, and there's always going to be great days, right? There are always going to be flashes of brilliance and performances that make you just like stop in your tracks. That said, I think Sri Lankan cricket has been on an upturn. I feel like ever since Mickey Arthur arrived as coach, probably just before the COVID pandemic, Sri Lankan cricket's been kind of steadily climbing. I don't think that too many people were hugely optimistic about Chris Silverwood's appointment, but I feel like that's been a continued period of growth, and that a lot of that maybe comes down to the selectors. I was thinking yesterday about the players who've been introduced and who have been successful over the past couple of years. And I mean, I listed them on Twitter yesterday, you know, guys like Mahesh Theekshana, you know, Patirana, Charith Asalanka, Madhushankar. You know, there's a Prabhat Jayasuriya coming into the Test side as an older spin bowler. You know, a lot of guys, Dunith Walalage being picked straight from schools cricket. A lot of guys have come into the Sri Lanka team and done really well. And especially like, I can't remember the bowling stocks actually being this deep in a long time, both in terms of seam bowling and spin bowling. I mean, I think in either of those disciplines, I can name like, you know, 5 or 6 guys who are good enough to be in the Sri Lanka team. Whereas, you know, 5 years ago, I think that was a real struggle. And at the same time, I mean, it also seems that over the last couple of years, a lot of more senior players are also taking big steps forward. I'm thinking of like Dushmantha Chamira, looked like a much more threatening bowler, kind of like turning 28, 29, 30. And suddenly I've been seeing like a sense of the fulfillment of promise that I've been hoping to see from Lahira Kumara for like ever since I first went to Sri Lanka in 2017. I mean, suddenly he seems to be bowling with like a lot more control and a lot more brains, and looks like he could become a really good T20 bowler. I think like the area where Sri Lanka are, I mean, not struggling, but are just like capricious is like batters' inconsistency, right? Charith Asalanka can look like a world beater one day and then have a series of scratchy scores. And I feel like you just don't know what you're going to get from Sri Lanka's batters. And I mean, watching the LPL, I know there are issues with like, are they producing batting friendly wickets? But there aren't a load of guys around who are coming in and striking at like 150, 160. I mean, like Shanaka has, you know, he's done amazingly in India, and he is like the natural finisher, right? But apart from Tisara Pereira, who no longer plays international cricket, I can't think of anyone else who could slot into that role.
Not a Barnaker fan then, Nick, no?
Yeah, no, Barnaker, I think Barnaker needs to bat earlier in the innings. I think that, like, for me, Charith and Barnaker have to bat like 3 and 4 or 4 and 5, and they have to be scoring the bulk of the runs if Sri Lanka are going to be successful in T20 cricket. Yeah, but I don't know. It's like, it's one of those things that I'm not quite sure where Sri Lanka are, but I think they're in a better place than they were a couple of years ago.
I think the bigger kind of existential question around Sri Lankan cricket, and when you look at the history of Sri Lankan cricket, is at the moments of great success, are they doing that despite the kind of administration and the not the foundations? I think the foundations of Sri Lankan cricket are pretty strong, but despite everything around it being chaos, or are they successful and going out and getting to World Cup finals and putting out really competitive teams when the administration is on the same page as everyone else and has got a clear strategy, and then you've got to kind of, as a fan, you've got to try and work out where we are in that process. And actually, I can't remember how many people have captained Sri Lanka in the last 10 years. I couldn't tell you all the coaches we've had in the last 10 years. I'll definitely forget.
Actually,
someone.
Shanaka might be the one who's kind of most consistently captained if you take the last decade, right? Because he's and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mark, but isn't that part of why the success has come about? The fact that during the last 2.5 years, we've seen a lot more consistency. I think Nick rightly pointed out it's a lot to do with the selections, right? Where players have been given that time to settle into the side a little bit, rather than the changing. Because Sri Lanka doesn't play as much cricket as some of the other countries. Like if you think about the big three, so there isn't a hell of a lot of time for a player. I mean, if you take the example of Zach Crawley, right? They can afford to give him 15 tests because they're playing 15 tests every year. Sri Lanka is playing 5. So, I mean, it's a very difficult situation. And I think given that circumstance, and to get back to your point, Mark, I think you have to say it's despite the difficulties that there have been some good things happening. And that's why now we are kind of seeing a little bit of, the team moving forward.
I think
that's. I was just going to say that's why I often refer to the fact that Sri Lanka even have a cricket team as in some ways it's a miracle, right? It defies all logic when you look at selectors picking themselves. You go through Nick's book and basically every chapter there's 2 or 3 stories in it where you're like, wow, how was that had to happen?
I think you're right to touch on the consistency, though, Estelle. I feel like there have been periods where every game Sri Lanka play, there's a new player coming in who I'd never heard of. And that hasn't happened over the last 2 years, right? Where it feels like there have been a settled core of players and players on the fringes who it's just felt a lot more settled and balanced, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because it's the last 3 years have been the most disruptive, or not the most disruptive, but they've been pretty disruptive outside of the sport, right? With COVID, with the economic and the situation in Sri Lanka. Yet they've kind of managed to keep, like you said, that core intact. And I think one great sign is the fact that so many players are now in consideration for franchise cricket, right? 3 years ago, no one was getting picked in any franchise games. I mean, apart from the BPL, no one had their eyes on Sri Lanka. And suddenly we have, 10, 12 players out of the country playing 2 to 3 leagues.
Yeah, that's huge. And you would think that that's only going to be a further springboard for the more players that are playing in, the IPL, the SAT20, the IL20, the more they're going to come back and just boost Sri Lankan cricket, right?
Yeah, I think that's what's going to, I don't want to say save it, but that's what's going to get Sri Lanka cricket back to where it once was, because it's an opportunity for so many great players to develop players and get them on par with the kind of cricket they'll need to play at an international level. Anyway, what we should do is leave it there because we've been chatting for ages. We'll definitely get Nick back on the pod another time. You've been listening to Sri Lanka 99.94. You can follow Estelle on Twitter at Estelle_Vasudev1 as the number 1. You can follow me on Twitter at Mark Machado. I was going to ask him what his Twitter handle was. I think it's at Nick Brookes Writes.
It's
Brookes Writes.
At Brookes Writes.
Yeah.
Brookes Writes. There you go. And you can also follow the show at SL on 9994DM. I didn't need to have it written down there, Estelle. I finally learned it.
Good job. Good job.
Thanks. And we'll be back with lots more Sri Lankan content. We'll definitely, once we've figured out who the selectors are, we'll be back to tell you who they are. And we've also got a Women's World Cup starting in just, I think, about 4 or 5 days now. So we'll be back with updates from that tournament as well. Estelle can tell us all about going to the launch of the official shirt. The shirt looked really good. Any shirt that has that fade and the line, I'm all for. And we'll be back in your wherever you get your podcast from and on YouTube very soon. Thanks for listening. Bye.